Hello, it's Greg Otten here with MaritimeGardening.com. I thought I would shoot a video on how to build Hugelkultur gardens. There's plenty of videos online on how to do this, but I just thought I'd do one because there was interest from the viewers. This here is some footage from about a month ago in one of my other Hugelkultur design gardens where I'm pulling some potatoes that are there, and the potatoes were just fantastic. Really one of the best crops of potatoes I ever had using this approach to gardening. So I thought I'd do a video on how to do that and how to do it in a way where it doesn't really cost a penny. I'm just using like dead trees and stuff my neighbors threw away to build one. So stick around and have a look at how this goes together. So here we are in the area of my garden where I built the Ruth Stout gardens, and I decided to take one of those spaces, the one with the bow saw and axe on it there in the foreground, and make it into kind of like a raised bed type thing. These are just logs that I live in a semi-rural area, so people are always cutting down dead trees and stuff like that on their property. So I got a bunch of dead trees from next door neighbor. He just cut down all these trees because they were worried they were going to fall on his kids and stuff. So I said, well, I'll take them. And what can I do with these? And I had this area, I was growing potatoes here using a Ruth Stout approach. And the lower gardens, the two that are behind me, I used a Hugelkultur, but a lot more work goes into a Hugelkultur garden. But man, the results are fantastic. So I thought it'd be interesting to do a video on how to do that, and just using basic tools and basically using stuff you can source for free if you live in an area where that sort of thing is available. Or I mean, you can be resourceful. People throw away timbers and stuff like that on the street sometimes. You probably wouldn't want to have anything with too much paint or pest, that sort of stuff. Green stuff they treat lumber with. But anyway. So here I am just trying to get a sense of the spacing and where everything should go. I'm just using this stick. I'm measuring how far apart the other two beds are so I can be somewhat consistent. I need enough space between the beds so I can run my lawnmower. The gardens to the right of me all have wood chips in between the bed, but these are outside the fenced enclosure of my garden. And it's just kind of wild back here. I can only grow certain things here, otherwise the animals will get at it. Potatoes are fine, tomatoes are fine, pumpkins, for some reason, they don't seem to bother pumpkins. So anyway, you figure out where you want the garden to go, and you lay down your logs. And I'm not using any screws or nails or anything here. I'm just putting pegs. The most important thing is that you have the pegs outside the logs. Once you start filling the center of the garden with earth, the earth will push outward on the logs and hold them against the pegs. So you might want a peg or two in the middle just to hold it in place while you're working there. Once you fill that with soil and everything, the insides take care of themselves. You just need to have pegs on the outside. And I use pegs just because the whole thing's temporary. You're using wood that's going to rot. The whole thing is going to last maybe 5 years or more. Who knows? I'm not, if I'm lucky, maybe 10. But it's perpetually breaking down and rotting. So there's no point in getting too fussy about how it goes together. Hell, the plants don't care how it goes together. As long as the plants are getting the things they need, water and nutrients, they're happy. So here I am. These are some stakes I had holding up tomatoes. They're old stakes. There's no point in putting anything good in the ground. You might as well use old stuff because it's just going to rot anyway. But you'd be surprised. These are, I think, were spruce from spruce trees. You'd be surprised how long a stake will last. You drive it into the ground. I've always been amazed at how long it takes things to rot when you think they'd rot very quickly because they're not treated with anything. And I don't quite understand that dynamic, but it seems like things you don't mind rotting last forever, and things you don't want to rot very quickly. So here I am just again, getting a sense of space and where everything should go. I'm not being overly fussy about that, but it's good to have, that all depends on your own personal sense of taste or aesthetics or whatever. I like things to be somewhat square, somewhat lined up, but as you can tell, I'm not using any precision tools here. I'm not making sure it's just whatever, if it's square to the eye, that's fine with me. I try to make it level. The ground has a bit of a slope. It slopes down to the left there. It slopes forward. The way the camera's face is sloped, where you're facing down is a slight grade, and it also slopes to the left. So, you know, I'm not going to dig up the ground and level it out and do all that sort of stuff, but just get it close enough. Close enough is good enough. In my opinion, this isn't my front yard. This is, you know, a good ways from the road here. I don't really care. I'm the only person looking at it, me and my kids and whatever guests we might have. So, yeah, I speed the camera up here because, you know, we don't want to be watching me do this all day. But you need a lot of pegs. You need a lot of pegs to do this, to hold everything in place and just to keep it from moving around. But on the good side, you really only have to do this once. And if you're going to be, you know, using an axe and making pegs and stuff like that, you need a really sharp axe. And how do you know your axe is sharp? It should be able to slice off pieces of a little branch or twig, no problemo like that, just like you were cutting it with a sharp knife. The sharper your axe is, the easier it is to use, the safer it is to use. And I just thought I'd add a little bit in there. This isn't a video on axe safety, but this would be cutting the pegs and all that stuff. It looks pretty easy the way I'm doing it, but it's because my axe is sharp. I just turned that log around because the fat end is on the left-hand side. So, you know, because it has it's sloping to the left there, I want the thicker end of the log on the left-hand side, so it sort of, to some extent, evens out. Looks somewhat level. It's not level, but it looks a little bit more level. So you just put that log on top of the other one and pound a few pegs in on the inside just to hold it in place. Once the dirt's in there, once I put all the soil in there, it'll all hold itself together just fine. And it's amazing how well things come together. Once you get the soil in there and it's rained on a few times, it all just kind of melts together. The soil acts like a mortar, and it just sort of grows together, funguses together, and just sort of sticks together. And even when it's very, very rotten, you'd be surprised how long the log holds up. Even when it's, like right now the log is, it's only been dead a short amount of time, but once it's, even when it's very rotten, it still holds itself together, even though it might weigh a quarter of what it did before. So here I am cutting off the end of the log here. This log isn't, the end isn't square. And man, there's just something nice about using a bow saw, the cadence of it, the rhythm of it. I think that bow saw cost me like $20, blade and everything. And man, you can get a lot done with a bow saw. And it's good exercise. You know, it's certainly, you know, if that's the only tool you've got, use that. No, there's nothing. You don't need to spend a fortune to have a garden. Now, that being said, you can't beat a chainsaw. It's a lot easier to use if you got a chainsaw, use a damn chainsaw. It's a lot easier to get things done. It was that particular day. It was even though it was around the end of October, which should be cold. It was. I mean, look at me. I'm wearing a t-shirt. It was 18 degrees outside in the sun. So I didn't much feel like doing everything with hand tools if I could avoid it, so I fired up the old chainsaw. So I'm just stepping the top log in, so I move that in the width of the log, flipping the log over here so that the fatter end is facing downhill, because that'll make it somewhat more level. So yeah, I'm just stepping in that top log and just cutting it off square. I mean, when I say square, I don't mean square the way a carpenter would think, but just square enough, just so it doesn't, you know, hook on your pants when you walk by. You know, I really do think people put way too much thought and energy into how their gardens look, or the aesthetics of the garden. It doesn't matter at all. I mean, the soil health is what matters. Healthy soil yields productive gardens. So, yeah, man, you know, my mentality is that you should be focused on your soil, healthy soil. All this other stuff, I mean, you don't even need, if you're doing a hugelkultur garden, you don't need to put a box around it. I just kind of like having a frame because it keeps the weeds from migrating in to some extent. It just makes it easier to manage. Also potatoes, if you're growing them in a garden, they'll grow out the sides and get green and stuff like that, whereas if they're growing against the logs there, that won't happen. And also those logs, that frame, as they rot, they hold a lot of water. So you may be amazed how much rotten logs can do to just maintain the moisture level in your garden, which is one of the main principles in a hugelkultur bed, because as you're going to see as we go on here, I'm going to dig all the dirt out and put a bunch of rotten logs in the bottom. That's the whole idea. You fill it, you take all the dirt out of the hole. It's almost like digging a grave, but you dig a trench about a foot deep, and you put all that soil aside, and then you fill the garden, you fill the trench with rotten logs and dead leaves and manure and hay and just whatever sort of organic material you can get your hands on. And then you put the soil back on top, and it creates an environment that's favorable to the organisms that improve soil, the worms and all those other microorganisms and stuff like that. It just creates this almost like a compost pile underneath your soil. And as those different microorganisms and organisms are moving around, they'll carry soil nutrients and so on from the breaking down part below up into the actual soil where you're growing your plants. This might seem backwards to some people, but I put for the butt ends, and when I'm making things out of logs, I seem to always do it this way. I do the top part, and then I jam, for the butt ends anyway, I do the top, and then I sort of jam the bottom part underneath. I don't know why I do it that way. It would make sense to make the bottom and then go up, but again, we're not building a house here. This isn't a load-bearing structure or anything like that. The goal is to slap it together as fast as you can, and just make it so it functions effectively, because it's not going to last. The whole thing's rotting. And actually, when that frame gets so rotten it won't hold together, it'd probably be about time to dig it up and put the frame in the hole, make a new hole and put the frame in the hole, and make a whole new hugelkultur garden. So it's a very elegant way to garden, I think. Anyway, so here's me just doing this sort of illogical way of putting it together. And then what I'm doing now is just taking the bit of soil that was on top there from the previous year's Ruth Stout garden, and just pushing the soil up against the sides, almost like a mortar, just to sort of hold it together and make it a little more snug. Now, you got to dig up all the soil that's in the garden. You got to get all that stuff out of there, because you're making a trench to put rotten debris in, especially logs. So I started off using the pickaxe because I thought there'd be a lot of rocks. And where I live, Nova Scotia, there's an incredible amount of rocks. There's rocks everywhere. If you take a walk in the woods behind me, you'll see these giant rocks just sticking out of the ground all over the place, almost Stonehenge-like. Anyway, if you were to just shovel the soil onto the grass adjacent to the garden, you would lose a lot of it. It just seems to disappear, and then you have to shovel it back. So in my mind, it's a lot easier and economical to just shovel it into containers or tarps or whatever you've got. I have a lot of these big containers. So actually, some of these I found on the beach. Those big square-looking ones in the background in the wheelbarrow, those are fishing buckets. Fishers out in the ocean, when they're catching cod and haddock and stuff like that, they'll put them in those to store them. When I was a kid, I used to go out fishing in a fishing boat, and a couple guys could fill one of those with fish in an hour, no problem, just using hand lines. Of course, they killed all the fish, so it's not as easy to do now, and it's really sad. I'm laughing, but it's really anyone that grew up with that lifestyle, it's an incredible loss. I mean, there's still fish you can catch in the ocean, but the ones that we used to catch when I was a boy, haddock and cod and stuff like that, they're much harder to come by and nowhere near the kind of numbers that existed back then. Anyway, not a gardening topic. Although, you know, all the guts from those fish we used to bury in our garden and do wonders for the soil. Anyway, so here I am getting this stuff out, and you can see, like, even though I just pegged those that frame together, right? It's just pegged together. I'm dragging the buckets over the logs, and see, I'm sort of dragging them over that, and they're not moving; they're staying in place. So you'd be surprised how well these pegs do in just holding the whole thing together. I can't recall how I started using pegs to build gardens. But I think it was just one day I wanted to build a frame. I'd always just bought lumber at the lumber yard and used screws and made it perfectly square and all this sort of stuff. And then one day I wanted to build a garden. I live about, I don't know, 30 minutes outside of where you can buy anything. I just didn't feel like doing all the driving. And I said, look, I'm surrounded in lumber. I got lumber everywhere. It's not, you know, perfect lumber, but it's free. All I got to do is cut it down. There's a lot of dead trees. So I just said, why don't I just use those, and who cares what it looks like? The plants do not care what your garden looks like. They could care less. And furthermore, you know, if you're in an area like that where there's a lot of forest and so on, you have access to it. The forest behind my house here, that's my land. I own that land. I can do whatever I want there. I like to leave it wild, but if there's something in there I need, I go take it. If you're going to be sourcing out dead trees and stuff like that to put in a hugelkultur bed, the ones that you have on the sides, if you're going to build it like a box, you don't have to build it like a box. It can just be a mound. If you want to build it like a box, standing trees are good for that. But the ones you throw in the garden, if you can, find the rotten logs that are on the ground, because they'll have already absorbed a lot of nitrogen from the ground and from the air and so on to break down. And that way they won't, they're just more on their way. They're more rotten sort of thing. They're already charged up with fungi and all this other sort of stuff. So they're just, you know, more on their way to where you want them to go. You noticed earlier, I don't know why I do this. I have no particular reason. Maybe some year I'll come up with a good reason. It's almost like an instinct type thing, but whenever I find rocks, I tend to jam them in the corners of the bed. I have no idea why I do that, but I guess at some level I think it preserves the corner. I don't know. But I can't explain why I do that, but that's what I do. The other thing is when you're digging your trench, I like to leave about between the trench and the wall about 8 inches of soil, just so that, because the pegs are in that, so just to allow the pegs that are holding the wall in place to maintain their integrity, right? So I dig a trench, but the trench doesn't go all the way to the side. It goes to within 8 inches of the side. I'm sure there's 1,000 different ways to do this. It's just what I do. It seems to work for me. The main thing is that you've dug a grave there. It's about, I don't know, that's about a foot deep or 16 inches deep. And there's a good picture of it there. It's about a foot deep, I guess. And that's all you need. You don't need to go any deeper than that. And actually, if you start going deeper than that, the soil isn't, you know, you want the soil from the top is the more fertile soil. And once you get deeper and deeper, at least in this part of the world, it becomes clay. So better off to leave that clay down there. And to some extent, it'll become like a well, right? And water will go into that hole, and it'll soak all the rotten stuff that's in there, and that stuff will just swell up with water, and the garden will never need to be watered. The 2 beds down the hill there where I had potatoes, those were my biggest potatoes this year, most productive plants. Never watered it once, never did a thing with it, never weeded it, never did nothing. Just stuck the potatoes in the ground and didn't come back for 3 months. I think at this point in time, right around here, I was throwing logs in here. My camera battery died, and I didn't get to film the rest of that, and so that was it for that day. I had to pick it up the next day. It was a huge storm brewing that day, but just to give a sense of, so I filled that with some rotten logs that I had kicking around, and then I dumped a bag of leaves that, this time of year in the fall, all your neighbors are very kind. They buy big paper bags, and they fill them up with organic matter, and they bring them to the side of the road for you. So it's fantastic. So I had a truck full of leaves and twigs and sticks and all kinds of stuff like that. And I use the bags for other stuff as well. The bags are incredible weed suppressors. So I fold those up and put them aside, and next spring when things start to grow, if I've got a place with weeds or whatever, I'll just put the bags over the weeds and weight them down with some, other stuff. This is, some neighbor had to cut down some ornamental grasses. Doesn't matter what you put in there, it's all going to break down. There's some good green there. That's good stuff. There's some more leaves. So all that stuff is going to be, all of those materials will be a good habitat for the organisms and the kind of fungi and stuff that makes soil better. Another thing, when you're getting stuff people have thrown away like that, you should be careful that there's no sticks with nails in them. You never know what people will throw away. Anyway, this is some seaweed I got from the beach, and as you can tell, because it's crawling with marine life, I just got it half an hour before I shot this. A huge storm brewing. Anyway, you can see those little shrimp-like things. They're called sand fleas or sand hoppers. I'm sure there's some biological name for them. But whatever those things are, they're marine life, so they're just going to die. This is not the place for them. They need to be by the ocean. So they'll die and become amazing fertilizer in my garden, which is fine by me. So this is just all seaweed that washed up on the shore. It's dead seaweed. It's, through wave motion or whatever, it had become disconnected from wherever it was growing. So it's all over the place here. You check your local laws if you're allowed to gather dead seaweed or not, and make sure you're not trespassing on someone's land. This actually is from someone's land, but I knocked on their door and introduced myself and developed a relationship with those people. They don't mind me taking seaweed. So that's a layer of seaweed, and now I'm putting a layer of, this is horse manure. I'm putting some horse manure down because I think that's just, full of good stuff, full of microorganisms and all the stuff that was in the horse's stomach, and just, I find horse manure really seems to help accelerate the compost process. Yes, it has weeds in it, but I'm not too worried about that. So basically making a big compost bin here, right? This is a giant compost bin. It's so much more elegant than putting stuff in a compost bin and waiting and turning and frigging around with it and then putting it on your garden. Why do that? Why not just build a compost bin and put some soil on top of it and let the worms and all the different organisms in the soil move the nutrients up into the top and move everything around for you. Let nature, this is the permaculture approach, right? Let nature help you. So that's what I'm doing. That looks like hay, but it's like that hay basically smells like pee. it's spoiled stable hay from a horse barn. So even though it looks like hay, it's that particular hay is full of manure, and the smell was incredible. The smell of urea. So if you know what that means, so it's definitely good for the garden. And remember, this is the fall, so I'm not going to be planting into this till like next May. So I'm not too worried about any sort of thing like that. So now I've got all the different layers, and you don't have to use the inputs I used. You just use whatever you can get your hands on. This is what I can get my hand on. So now I'm putting the soil back on top, right? And it's going to be mounded up a bit, but I guarantee you by next spring the level will have dropped probably down to down 5 or 6 inches from where it is right now. It'll just all go down and compress a little bit. But you keep adding layers of mulch on top, and those will add to the soil as well and feed the soil. You see how well this, you can see I'm just dragging stuff over the sides and being very rough with the box, and it's holding up just fine. So you don't need anything sort of fancy implements to build a box garden. Just pegs and rotten logs. Perfectly fine, and they'll last quite a while, and those rotten logs are probably a couple hundred living things in each of those logs anyway. So it's definitely an economical approach to building gardens, and I actually kind of like the look of it. It's got a sort of medieval look that I find pleasing. It's my garden, so as long as it's pleasing to me, that's all that matters. So now I got some hay, just throwing on top. This is what they call spoiled hay. It's hay from a horse stable that horses wouldn't eat. So if you can get into a friendly relationship with a stable owner, they usually have a manure pile, and they throw all the spoiled hay on top of the manure pile. So you can just pick that stuff out if that's something like that near you, or if you got access to something like that. And yeah, just sort of spread that out. And I like using a pitchfork. It's working with hay or seaweed. It's kind of like working with spaghetti, I guess. So I'm just sort of putting this on and making almost like a nice warm blanket or a roof, because it's October right now. It's going to get colder and colder, but I'm hoping that this can break down a bit and be productive next spring. Anyway, that's the video. Great place to take a nap too if you're tired from digging dirt. That took about 2 hours start to finish, all in. I hope you enjoyed the content. I hope this was useful. If you have any questions, let me know in the comment section. And until next time, get out there, get at it, and have fun in your garden. Thanks for watching.